welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and today we discuss the topic of how enslaved people emancipated themselves. And this, I'm sure, reminds people in the Caribbean of the fact that our forefathers 400 years ago knew that they had to emancipate themselves. And of course, 40 years ago, Bob Marley reminded us that we must emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. The majority of people in the English-speaking Caribbean are descendants of the victims of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans, the greatest crime against humanity. And in examining this topic, we must look first at the international question. And the question of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans is extremely important up to the present time. It's not just some historical event that we can forget about. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, traffickers exported captives from what they call factories. The factories coming from a Portuguese word Vitória, which is a sort of trading post, a fortified trading post. That's where the word Vitória comes from. So European countries had established these factories all the way from Senegal to Angola on the West African coast. And the captives were trafficked across the Atlantic through what is called the Middle Passage. And this eventually formed something called a triangular trade. You know, people left European countries with goods, which they brought in exchange on the West African coast. That was the first leg. And then captives were taken from West Africa into the Caribbean and the Americas as the second leg. And then rum and sugar and molasses, were taken from the Caribbean and the Americas to England. So it formed a triangular trade. And of course, the harshest leg of that triangular trade was the Middle Passage, in which captives were actually taken from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas, and of course, many of them died. The Americans were involved, but the leaders were really European, the leaders of the trade, British, Danish. Some people don't know that the Danes were involved. In fact, the Danes actually had a colony in the Caribbean at one stage. It's now, I think, the United States Virgin Islands. The Dutch were involved deeply, French were involved, Portuguese were perhaps the first to enter the trade because they started removing, since 1441, they started removing Africans, seizing and capturing Africans and taking them, some to Portugal and some to Madeira. And of course, Madeira was a sugar producing settlement at that time. Spanish were involved, and the Swedish. These were great maritime empires, particularly the British, Danish, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Swedish. Well, of course, many of them had coasts on the Atlantic, and that is what gave them the advantage and opportunity to become great Atlantic powers and to become great maritime empires. And all of these states participated in transatlantic trade in captive Africans. British alone transported 3.5 million Africans to the Americas. And as you know, about 750,000 of the enslaved Africans in what came to be known as the British West Indies became free on the 1st of August, 1834. Many people in the Caribbean are the descendants of those victims of the transatlantic trade. And on the 1st of August, they will commemorate the 184th anniversary of Emancipation. We can't deal so much with the trade now. We deal with the factors which led to emancipation. To start with, we must all understand that the enslaved Africans never accepted their subjugation. For 400 years, they never accepted their subjugation. From the time they were captured, they resorted to mutinies, and sometimes the mutineers were simply thrown overboard in the Atlantic. when they landed, there was resistance on the plantations. There were riots on the plantations. There were revolts on the plantations. And there's marronage, that is to say, the practice of enslaved people running away from the plantation and setting up settlements in the hinterland. Of course, in Suriname, the Maroons, as they were called, set up some settlements, and many of them still live in the hinterland settlements. In Jamaica, people still live in those hinterland settlements. And many people don't know that in Guyana, we actually had Maroons, and there's a great Maroon War in 1795 in the backlands of the Burusiri on the West Demerara. So Africans never accepted it, and they always resisted, and they always revolted at any given opportunity. And of course, we remember in Guyana, at the time, Berbice was a separate colony, a Dutch colony. In 1763, a huge revolt occurred, and that is commemorated as the Berbice revolt of 1763, led by Kofi. And again in Demerara in 1823, there was a revolt, as you know, in Bachelor's Adventure. And in Essequibo in 1834, there's a revolt led by Damon. In the Caribbean, there were several serious revolts. Of course, the most important is it was more than a revolt, it was a revolution led by Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. And that revolution is the only successful revolt in the Caribbean, and it inspired other countries. And from 1795, you can see that there was really a tsunami of riots and revolts leading up to 1834. Apart from the Haitian Revolution, which we all know about, and those of you who studied Caribbean history would know that that is a major topic in Caribbean history. There was also Fédon revolt in Grenada, a leader called Fédon in 1795. In Barbados, there was a revolt led by Moussa in 1816. In Jamaica, there was a revolt led by Sam Sharp in 1831. So in addition to revolts in Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice, many of the Caribbean islands had revolts by very prominent leaders, and they were hammer blows on the system of enslavement. And all of these revolts helped to bring enslavement down, by 1838, until 1838, when, of course, emancipation was granted legally. Now, there were many international factors which contributed to emancipation, and we must not fall into the trap of believing there was just one factor, what the historians call monocausation. Certainly, the most important was resistance and revolt and riots and the mutinies and the marronage of the enslaved persons. This was the single most important cause that led to emancipation. But in addition to that, there was a transition from the old style colonialism, which was based on conquest and settlement, to what is called the mercantile system or mercantilism, which was based largely on maritime commerce. So as the European countries started to become more capable of industries and manufactures and shipping, this triangular trade that I mentioned a few minutes ago developed. And that was called mercantilism, the mercantile system. And in addition to that, of course, was the emergence of what is called industrial capitalism. This is not the manufacture of a few items, but this is a huge scale. These are the establishment of factories and the mass producing of textiles and guns and other products, which they wanted to sell to Africa and to the Caribbean and to the Americas. So the triangular trade created an Atlantic economy. Previously, there was a Mediterranean economy, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Carthage, and so on. But there was a gradual shift from the 16th and 17th centuries from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. And one of the characteristics of this new Atlantic economy and the Caribbean economy was, of course, the rise of mercantilism and the circulation of manufactured goods through the Industrial Revolution in Europe. At the same time, there was the exploration and exploitation of new lands in Asia. And in addition to just having a few colonies, they started to develop what later on became known as imperialism. I think you know very well, by the end of the 19th century, there was a Berlin Conference towards the end of the 19th century, the Berlin Conference, and the whole Africa, the entire Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, was divided up among European countries. Tribes were divided, and Britain claimed a part, France claimed a part, Germany claimed a part, and the entire continent was divided up. That was the age of imperialism. But the stirrings, the early settlements that we saw in the colonial period now grew into huge colonies all over Africa and Asia, and of course in South America as well. In addition to that, we had the diffusion of ideas of enlightenment, and this was very important in triggering the French Revolution. That thinkers, philosophers, Rousseau and others, Voltaire, started to speak of the rights of man, and the French Revolution brought to the fore, the debates and discussions on the rights of man, and of course the revolution had an impact on Haiti, and eventually that type of enlightenment, that type of enlightened thinking had an impact on the American Revolution. So it is a factor. The Enlightenment was a factor in which people started to question the old, ways of conquest and dominating the rest of the world. There was also the diffusion of Christian evangelism, of Christian ideas. After the Reformation, of course, in the 16th century, there were groups of Christians who were concerned that it was sinful, it was wrong, it was unlawful for one human to own or possess or dominate another human, to exploit humans. The human exploitation of other humans was regarded as sinful, and there were several evangelical groups in present day world. Very well of the Amish and the Quakers. Well, these groups had their origin in the 17th and 18th centuries, and many of them felt that slavery was wrong, and they some of them completely had nothing to do with slavery. They resisted slavery, and that is one thing we should remember, that there were evangelical groups which resisted slavery, and some of them came to Guyana. Of course, the LMS, the London Missionary Society, and from the London Missionary Society, we have one of the participants in that society was the Congregational Church, which we still have in Guyana, and that is one of the reasons why so many congregational churches are named after abolitionists like Wilberforce and Clarkson. But these were people who were evangelical, and they were Christians, and they fought against enslavement. Then there was the advocacy of civil society. I don't think it was called civil society then, but now in Guyana we know the importance of civil society. For example, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Since 1787, 20 years before the slave trade was actually abolished, this society was formed in Britain, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Then we had the Society for the Mitigation uh, and the gradual abolition of slavery in 1823, the year of our Demerara revolt. And of course, you had other societies like the Society of Friends, which gave birth to some of the evangelical groups in the United States of America. There's also the factor of electoral reform in Britain, and through something called the Representation of the People Act. Many Guyanese would know about the Representation of the People Act in 2020, 2022. But there was a Representation of the People Act in Britain in 1832. And this arose out of the Reform Act of the same year. But what was important is that it enabled the enfranchisement, the empowerment of the bourgeoisie. When I speak of bourgeoisie, I don't talk about, I don't mean civil servants and school teachers and so on. This is the grand bourgeoisie, manufacturers and financiers and bankers, industrialists, shippers. The grand bourgeoisie, was empowered because prior to that, the British electoral system was rotten, and many of these ambitious classes were kept out of power. And because of the pressure, the wealth, and the fact that they were leading in maritime trade and commerce and manufacture and so on, they were gradually brought into the political system, and they demanded power, power that was commensurate with their wealth. So they started to break down the monopoly of the ruling classes. Then, the royalty and the higher classes, and to seek a share in power. And this started to happen around the 1830s. So very significant that all of these things were taking place while the Africans in the Caribbean and elsewhere were struggling for emancipation. So in addition to enfranchising, and empowering the bourgeoisie, we also had the introduction of ideas of free trade. Because in Britain, the protected markets existed, and there was a struggle to destroy protectionism and encourage free trade. The idea was that the same bourgeoisie wanted to get cheap grain and cheap sugar coming into Britain. And there were these members of the elite who wanted to enrich themselves by having protected markets. In the Caribbean, we are struggling to, for the last 30 years to set up the Caribbean single market and economy. And this is exactly what the British were doing, in the 1830s. Struggling for free trade. And in the Caribbean, unfortunately, people are still fighting against free trade, but Britain embraced that free trade since the 1830s by what they call the repeal of the Corn Laws. I wouldn't go into that now, but the commodities, grain and sugar, were very expensive. And it was found that the colonies of the Caribbean particularly were suffering from declining or unreliable production because of the exhaustion of lands in these old colonies. And of course, they relied on protected market for sugar. Much of what I'm saying, I'm sure, will be familiar to people in the Caribbean. This is like, nearly 200 years ago, people were fighting against, protected market for sugar. And, now what has happened in the Caribbean is that once that protection is removed, sugar production become very, very uncertain, very unstable. What happened, therefore, is that the manufacturers and the bourgeoisie wanted cheaper sugar. And because of the opening of new lands and the fact that other colonies, Cuba, Brazil, were producing cheaper sugar, they started to move away from the Caribbean and Caribbean sugar around about the same time. And, they felt then that it was a complete waste to keep supporting this plantocracy, this group of rich planters by, protecting their markets when, of course, cheaper sugar could be acquired from other countries. And of course, there was the problem of security from revolts and defense against other states. This was an age of warfare. And if you go through the Caribbean, you'd see forts and fortresses because the British attacked the Dutch and the Dutch attacked the French and the French attacked the Spanish. So the Caribbean became what is Eric Wilson called the cockpit of Europe. And that they were always fighting like fowlcocks among themselves. But it called into existence something called the British West India Regiment since 1795. So the regiment had to defend the colonies against foreign attacks from other empires and also suppress revolts from the slaves. So it was very expensive to maintain the system of slavery for both reasons. One, you had to establish and maintain this expensive British West India Regiment. And when you come to study the Demerara revolt, you see the British West India Regiment was here in Demerara in August 1823, when it was responsible for shooting 200 Africans during the Demerara revolt. So the British West India Regiment was no joke, and the British used them in West Africa and other parts around the world. They had beautiful uniforms, but it was a terror in terms of suppression of revolts throughout the Caribbean. So when we look at the international factors which led to emancipation, it was not just one cause, there were several causes. The Africans themselves never accepted it and they revolted. The mercantile system gradually replaced the old colonial system. New lands were being opened, Enlightenment, Christianity, electoral reform, the role of the bourgeoisie, and then of course the question of security against slave revolts and of course defense against foreign attacks. As a result of that, we saw that there was a steady, gradual but steady, relentless process towards emancipation. And it was not a single event, it was a process. And apart from the rumblings, going on in Britain among the churches and what you can call civil society and so on, there were certainly rumblings in the colonies, and of course, there were serious revolts. And by 1807, there was the definitive act of abolishing the slave trade. As you know, in 2007, the Caribbean observed the bicentenary of the abolition of slave trade. So the first step was the abolition of slave trade. It became unlawful for British ships to traffic Africans after that day. And of course, the British Navy was used in preventing other countries from trafficking. And in fact, Sierra Leone was carved out of West Africa as a refuge for persons who had been rescued, who had been captured and intended to be brought to the plantations in the Caribbean. And they were taken back to Africa, but nobody could be sure what part of Africa they came from. And so many of them were left at a place called Sierra Leone, and that's how Sierra Leone came into existence. And some of these freed captives actually came to Guyana. And some of them, were called crewmen because the ethnic group was Kru, K-R-U. And some of them are mixed with the African Guyanese. And so you'd see that it is a very complex historical process. But the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 was the first step. The second step was amelioration. That is to say that the conditions of slavery, again, under the impact of all of these changes I've been telling you about, were meant to be improved. And when the planters in Demerara heard about the amelioration proposals, they tried to prevent the enforcement of those proposals, and that was one of the contributory factors to the 1823 revolt. And all it called for was a reduction in the amount of field work, a reduction in punishment, for example, the punishment of women, the granting permission of Africans to marry, because before that they couldn't marry. In fact, life was very harsh. They were treated like domestic animals, two-legged domestic animals. And there were several other minor changes, but they were all short of freedom. Many Africans thought that they were getting freedom in 1823, but it didn't happen. And that was, again, one of the contributing factors to the Demerara Revolt. And the third stage was the Abolition Act, which was passed in 1833. And as you know, in 1834, the Portuguese started to arrive. And that act was meant to grant emancipation, but it was a fake act, really, because it provided for something called the apprenticeship system for 6 more years until 1840. But because of the African unwillingness to accept slavery, and of course, Damon's revolt was a deliberate reaction to the apprenticeships, the introduction of the apprenticeship scheme. And after a while, they realized apprenticeship wasn't working the way it was meant to work. That is, the same Africans were required to remain on the plantations and continue working for the same planters, and they wouldn't have it. And after 4 years, the system just collapsed, and emancipation was granted in 1838. And this meant that about 780,000 enslaved Africans in the British West Indies, the Cape of Good Hope, that is South Africa and Mauritius, became free from the 1st of August, 1834. And that is what we celebrate in the Caribbean. Now, what was significant is that emancipation, apart from the long, bloody trail leading to what I call liberation on the 1st of August, 1834, had earned enormous wealth for the Europeans, not only the Brits, but also, the Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Danes. And because of this, the wealth that was extracted from the labor, unpaid labor of hundreds of thousands of Africans, European maritime empires became extremely wealthy. And this was examined by Eric Williams in his book, Capitalism and Slavery. And of course, other writers are aware of the connection between slavery and capitalism, that the wealth that we see in the Atlantic economy, including America, and of course, Northern Europe particularly, was largely built on the backs of Black labor. And that era of enslavement, although it enriched certain European empires, it left a legacy of underdevelopment in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean is still technically underdeveloped. Caribbean economies remain and retain the emphasis on production for export. It's just that the primary commodities which they were established to produce no longer have guaranteed markets in Europe. And this is one of the big problems in the Caribbean today, our failure to transform our economies, after emancipation. And many of us are still, former colonies, independent countries, are still producing some of the commodities which they produced, 100, 200 years ago. Emancipation enriched the planter class. We call it plantocracy. They received about 20 million pounds under something called the Slave Compensation Act. They actually was an act of the British Parliament to pay compensation to the slave owners. And of course, the slaves got not a penny. And by present day calculation, the money that the plantation owners received in 1838 as a result of the Slave Compensation Act is worth about 16.5 billion pounds sterling today. So you can see the size of the debt the British alone owe to the Caribbean and other, to the descendants of the persons who were the victims of that slave trade, and particularly in the Caribbean and in other countries like in South Africa and Mauritius. So my friends, apart from not receiving any compensation, and that is of course the reason why there is an insistent demand now for reparations, emancipation had other effects, and one effect, of course, was the fact that it spawned ethnic diversity. Since 1834, even before full emancipation in 1838, plans were being made, and in shortly after, Portuguese started to arrive. Well, not from Portugal, but from Madeira, because Madeira was a sugar-producing community, and the Portuguese were the first indentured immigrants to come. Well, there were some other small groups, but the Portuguese were the first major group to come. And East Indians started to come in 1838. They actually started to arrive in May 1838, a few months before emancipation in August 1838. So there was an expectation that the Africans would leave the plantation. Of course, it didn't happen. The Africans continued to work, but under new conditions. But the diversity of the Guyanese population today is attributable to emancipation. Portuguese, Indians, Chinese, and some Africans from the Caribbean, and of course those from who were captured from Sierra Leone after the abolition of slave trade, actually created this tapestry of the Guyanese society that we are familiar with today. Emancipation, therefore, my friends, was not a gift. It was not an endowment from a gracious queen. It was an entitlement, and it is something that people fought and died for. And that is one of the reasons why we continue to demand reparations for this greatest crime against humanity. Reparations is an obligation that the British must pay. It is not an option that they can speak about somewhat appalling tragedy. It was a crime, and there must be reparations to the descendants of the victims of that great crime. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a happy emancipation on 1st of August. May God bless you all.
Let us cooperate for the younger. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Each man must